The glory days of ancient Egypt lasted for over 3,000 years. During that time, a love of gold consumed its pharaohs, while its military might dominated neighboring kingdoms. But a proud people from the south rose up to defeat their overlords and became the Black Pharaohs of Egypt. Little is known about their 75-year reign, but now fresh clues are being explored about the Nubians who used gold, gods, and grit to conquer all of Egypt. The Nubian Desert in northern Sudan. In ancient times, this was the center of a golden civilization called the Kush Empire. These aren't hills rising from the sand. They are the ruined tombs of Kushite kings and queens who once ruled over all of Egypt, but are now almost completely forgotten. This is the royal cemetery called El Kuru. It's one of a handful of places where scholars can dig for clues about the mysterious culture and the elusive history of the Kush people. That's what attracted archaeologist Jeff Emberling. At a pyramid called Q1, Jeff's team is moving 100 tons of earth, hoping to expose a royal tomb beneath. At one time, hundreds of workers toiled to construct this monument, stone by stone, in honor of a single powerful man. Today, no one even knows who he was.
We want, first of all, to find out the name of the king. And second of all, we would hope that there would be additional information in material left in the pyramid about where they fit in history over 2,000 years ago.
Jeff doesn't have a lot to go on. Over hundreds of years, the Q1 pyramid has been worn down by wind-blown sand and picked apart by looters in search of Nubian gold. What looks today like a pile of bricks once stood nearly 4 times as high. In modern times, this particular tomb has proven to be the toughest to crack, even for the man who first began excavating here. About 100 years ago, American archaeologist George Reisner excavated many Kush monuments and discovered the tombs of its most important kings.
George Reisner was an amazing pioneer of archaeology in Kush. He started in 1908, he worked into the 1930s, very difficult conditions, and yet he managed to establish a basic chronology, not only of the broad archaeological periods, but of all the kings of Kush. He put them all into order, and it's an order that we still basically use today.
At El Kuru, Reisner got to the bottom of every pyramid except Q1. The ceiling of the pyramid had collapsed, locking its secrets inside. Having just lost 5 men in a cave-in nearby, Reisner decided not to tempt fate any further and returned home. Sometimes, Jeff Emberling has thought of doing the same.
When you read Reisner's notes from his excavations at El Kuru, at the end of the season, he took about 2 weeks off. And he has a little note that the doctor told him he had to stop worrying so much. And I can kind of appreciate this now, even just excavating one of the pyramids, because there's inherent risk. There's no such thing as no risk.
Of course, without risk, there's no reward. And as Reisner discovered at other royal burial sites, the payoff can be staggering. In the other nearby temples, Reisner recovered golden jewelry and stunning artifacts. long-lost masterpieces buried with the Kushite kings to enrich them in the afterlife. The Nubian craftsmanship was stunning, intricate and innovative. The artistry on display was sometimes even more impressive than the ornaments created to the north in Egypt. To find even one surviving item would be a triumph for Jeff.
As an archaeologist, your dreams are often quite vivid about what you can find in a place. And so obviously these king's burials were once extremely rich with gold and silver objects and finely crafted, beautiful expressions of their religious sentiments as well as their status and prestige. So we could imagine finding all of those things inside the burial chamber.
Jeff's first big revelation is not gold treasure, but a giant staircase. One fit for a king-size funeral procession.
You can see that this staircase is really monumental. They've dug down through the solid rock to a depth of over 25 feet.
But at the bottom of the staircase, an ominous sign.
You can see just at the bottom there, the original doorway, and above it, an irregular hole. That irregular hole was dug by looters.
Jeff believes the tomb must have been looted long ago by someone familiar with its layout.
Unusually in this pyramid, the inner chamber is huge and high. And so it was only the people who built that would have known that digging over the doorway, they'd break into the open space of the chamber itself.
The question is, how far in did the looters get? And what, if anything, did they leave behind? Jeff is hoping he'll soon find out. Already, he's excavated to the site of the cave-in that had blocked Reisner's path.
We're in the second room of the pyramid. Its ceiling has entirely collapsed, covering whatever was below. I have a secret theory that the looters burrowed in here, and as they were digging, the ceiling collapsed on them.
It was just such a collapse that foiled looters in another tomb, keeping some of the treasure safe for centuries until Reisner was able to dig it up. Jeff's taking precautions to ensure he and his team don't become the tomb's next victims. He's installing a special iron scaffolding to make sure the ceiling doesn't collapse as the team digs deeper and deeper into the pyramid. If the structure holds, they just might succeed where Reisner did not, and help to right a great wrong the famous but flawed archaeologist committed against the African people. Throughout his time in Sudan, George Reisner excavated amid the rich local culture of his African hosts. He was pulling African history from the ground, but he was doing it at a time when racist delusions of ethnic superiority crippled his scientific judgment. Even as he was awed by the pyramids he excavated, he refused to believe they could have been built by the ancestors of the black Africans he saw all around him, even when clear evidence of the truth was staring him in the face. In 1916, Reisner's team uncovered beautiful granite statues of the great Kushite kings with features that strongly resembled black Africans. Reisner argued they were not accurate likenesses. Instead, his scholarly articles asserted that the kings and the builders of all the Kushite monuments must have been light-skinned foreigners.
I think it just challenges so fundamentally some of his personal views about what people in the Sudan were capable of, that he finds it really difficult to suddenly read the evidence. Such a huge challenge that he can't get over it.
Reisner wasn't the last or the first to underestimate the Kushites. Until recently, most archaeologists portrayed Kush as little more than a subject state within Egypt's empire. A source for gold in peacetime, and workers captured and enslaved during war. But by excavating neglected sites in these dangerous conditions, a new generation of scholars has uncovered a more accurate and more fascinating reality. The ancient Kushite Empire was far more advanced than anyone previously believed. One of the key Nubian sites lies about 270 kilometers downstream from the burial site of El Kuru, in the town of Kerma, Sudan. Looming over the landscape is an enormous and complex structure called a defufa. It's a Kushite temple built around the same time Egyptians were creating their first pyramids and the Britons Stonehenge. According to archaeologist Salah Eldin Mohammed Ahmed, that makes it one of Africa's oldest surviving buildings.
The defufa stands in the middle of the ancient town of Kerma, which is one of the most ancient towns in Africa. This town dates to around 2,500 before Christ, more than 4,000 years ago.
The defufa's building blocks are not stone, they're man-made bricks, evidence that the Nubians knew as much about construction as the Egyptians did at that time. Also around Kerma, a vast cemetery preserving elaborate burial practices points to a civilization that was already well developed in 2000 BC, when its better-known neighbor, Egypt, was uniting into a pharaoh-led empire. At first, the two up-and-coming nations were peers and forged a mutually beneficial relationship.
It was often a relationship based on trade. Evidence from Egyptian tombs shows depictions of people from the Sudan bringing tribute, as it's always characterized, into Egypt. So items like leopard skins, monkeys, precious stones.
Because of its location on the Nile, Kerma grew into a thriving trade hub between sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt, funneling ebony, ivory, and exotic animals north. But Kush's rise to power was really fueled by one thing: gold. Kushites and Egyptians valued gold for several reasons. It's rare, but not impossible to find. It's easy to smelt. It doesn't tarnish. And it's a symbol for the desert's most dominant feature, the sun. This pendant, recovered from a Kush royal tomb, is a raw nugget of gold, a sign that for the Kush people, gold had its own inherent mystical properties. Their Egyptian neighbors had an insatiable appetite for jewelry, gold leaf coffins, and funerary masks of the kind made famous by King Tut. Much of that gold was mined in Kush.
Kush was traditionally known to the Egyptians as the land of gold. So most of the gold of the Egyptian state came from Nubia, and mostly came from this area and also from the eastern desert to the east of Kerma.
The Egyptians also valued the Kushite skill as archers, calling them the bow people and employing them as mercenary soldiers. And Egyptian instructions on fighting record the Kushites' prowess as wrestlers, a tradition that still thrives in Sudan today. The military skills the Kush honed in the service of their Egyptian neighbors were eventually turned on the great empire itself. The Kushites started small, with incursions across the border to expand their territory. This angered the Egyptians. In about 1500 BC, Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose I invaded Kush to eliminate the growing threat and get direct access to the gold he coveted. His army marched south until they reached a sandstone butte called Jebel Barkal, or Pure Mountain. This would become one of the holiest and most disputed sites in the history of the world. Jebel Barkal had long been a landmark on the ancient highway following the fabled river. But this mountain was much more than a milepost to both Kushite and Egyptian people. Much of Jebel Barkal's mystique comes from an unusual natural tower separate from the mountain that rises nearly 76 meters into the sky. For Kushites, the pillar's phallic shape made it a symbol of creation and fertility. And according to archaeologist Tim Kendall, the Egyptians attached several more layers of significance to the sandstone tower.
What made this mountain so powerful and meaningful to the ancient Egyptians was the fact that it had this gigantic spire-like pinnacle on its south face that reminded them of multiple things that had great religious meaning. On the one hand, it looked like a rearing cobra. On the other hand, it looked like a standing king, Osiris, the mythical first king of Egypt.
The cobra is the key. In Egyptian mythology, cobras have a powerful connection to kingship. Goddesses take the shape of a cobra to protect the king. That's why they appear on the crowns of pharaohs, including King Tut's. Tim believes it was probably a high priest accompanying the invasion who first saw the connection. Jebel Barkal was declared to be the birthplace of the god of gods, Amun, and it provided moral justification to Pharaoh Thutmose I for seizing the Kush territory.
It confirmed the king's feeling that he was the rightful ruler of this place. Here was the center of the primeval god who'd started kingship here, and he was the heir of this kingship, and he had an absolute right to rule Kush.
For the next 400 years, Egyptian rulers honored Jebel Barkal by building temples in its shadow. And many sought to capture the mountain's divine magic by traveling the long road to Nubia in order to be crowned at this sacred birthplace of Amun, the holy father of the pharaohs.
We don't know exactly what happened in this temple, but we think that the king came in here during his coronation, came into this inner chamber with the god Amun, in an effigy, of course. Here, the two of them, father and son, united with the god Osiris, the mythical first king of Egypt. And then he went forth from the temple, climbed up the steps, sat down on the throne, and became king, and got up and stood on the porch and was greeted by the mob outside as the new living god.
In the beginning, the Kushites were forced to accept the religion of their conquerors in order to survive. They worshipped at the temples built by the Egyptians. Eventually, they surpassed even their conquerors in the intensity of their belief. The Kushite royals began building their tombs in the shape of pyramids, and the gold jewelry found in those tombs testifies to their devotion to the Egyptian gods. Isis, Hathor, Amun in the shape of a ram, all found by George Reisner in Kushite tombs.
They were adopting a worldview that had been long established, and they saw themselves fitting into it perfectly.
For 300 years, the Egyptians occupied Kush and imposed upon them the cults of Amun. Jebel Barkal was the epicenter of the fundamentalist fervor. The mountain kindled the religious spark that in time would set Egypt ablaze and turn Kushites into pharaohs. At El Kuru's Kuwan tomb, Jeff Imberling and his team have pushed beyond the rockfall that stopped George Reisner 100 years ago. For the Sudanese team members, like foreman Mansour Mohammed Ahmed, this is truly sacred ground.
متحسس شديد إنه جدا في علاقة وده تاريخي وجدودي وثقافتي منهم وحضارتي منهم وكل شيء منهم يعني بحس أنا منهم كلهم. والله أنا بحس بنفسي نحن تأخرنا شديد في التدوير عنهم يعني المفروض يكون من بدري نحن ندور عنهم ونعرف عنهم كل شيء.
They're at the very end of their dig season, and Jeff's funds are running low. When suddenly, they're confronted with a find that will change everything.
We were wondering all along whether there was going to be 2 burial chambers or possibly a third, and we discovered a doorway to the inner third burial chamber. You can just see the outline of this perfectly preserved doorway that goes into what will have been the final burial chamber of this pyramid.
A final chamber that could contain a treasure trove of burial objects or the bones of a king. But getting to it will take time. Time Jeff and his team may not have. The tomb's location reveals an important clue about the unknown king who built it. He wasn't humble about his place in history. He built his memorial right next to the tomb of one of the greatest Kushite kings. On this platform once lay the body of Pianki, the black African king who conquered Egypt. By 700 BC, some 800 years after their invasion, Egypt had withdrawn from Kush. The new kingdom empires of Tutankhamun and Ramses II had fallen to chaos. Warlords from Libya fought for control of the north, while priests in Thebes tried to hold the south together. The priests feared their cult of Amun would be destroyed. They knew their survival depended on reuniting the torn nation. So the Egyptian priests begged for help from a most unlikely source, their former colony, Kush. There, the young king, Pianki, heard their call. A devout follower of Amun, he was eager to fight for his god. He vowed to repel the Libyan kings, confident that with Amun on his side, he could not lose. His forces moved north on the Nile to Thebes. He told his army, "String the bow and let loose the arrow. Let the people of the Northland taste my fingers." It wasn't long before Pianki's enemies begged for peace. "Be merciful," cried one Libyan king. "I cannot see your face for shame. I cannot stand before your flame. I tremble at your strength."
The fact that Kush was able to conquer Egypt is really a David and Goliath story. Egypt has these huge cities, huge temples, lots and lots of people, and Kush, the settlements are more dispersed. So we're trying to figure out exactly how Kush was able to amass that military power.
In one of history's greatest upsets, Kushite King Pianki and his successors became Egypt's 25th dynasty. Their reign would be unlike any other before or since. The Kushite pharaohs controlled more area than any other dynasty, stretching from modern-day Khartoum to the Mediterranean, becoming rivals of mighty Assyria and Greece. This empire, built on gold, was now in power because of its religious belief and its military skill.
Political power has always been connected with religious beliefs. To convince the people that you have the right to rule over them, you have to be religious. And they're using this to control everything, the gold mines, the trade routes, and everything.
Pianki ruled from Kush for about a dozen years before handing the crown over to his younger brother, Shabaka. Shabaka moved north to take over the Egyptian capital, Memphis, and settle unrest in the Nile Delta. He launched a renaissance of building on a scale not seen since Egypt's New Kingdom heyday. Shabaka and his brother before him earned reputations as strong merchants.
They were famous for their piety and their magnanimity. For example, they didn't slaughter their prisoners, they forgave them. They put them to work digging canals. These are completely uncharacteristic features of ancient kings.
Pianki and Shabaka paved the way for another Kushite pharaoh, Taharka, who battled Egypt's foes far beyond the empire's borders. Around 700 BC, he even saved Jerusalem and King Solomon's temple from an assault by the Assyrians. For this act, recorded in the Old Testament, Hebrew historians hail Taharka as a savior of the people. Like the Egyptian rulers, Taharka tied himself to the sacred mountain. But he put his own stamp on the holy site.
In the 1930s, some British officials studying the mountain face with binoculars had seen that there was some traces of ancient workmanship up at the top of this rock spire that was completely inaccessible.
Decades later, a young archaeologist decided to get a look at it up close.
Well, I wasn't a climber, you know, I just had this drive to find out what this thing was, you know, so I became a climber in order to solve this mystery. And I'm not sure I'd do it again.
Tim made repeated, daring ascents and found an ancient inscription carved into the stone by Taharka. But climbing the crumbling 76-meter spire while photographing it was no easy feat. For his final report on the summit, he needs better photographs.
When we did this exercise in 1987, our results from today's perspective are fairly primitive.
So we should bring that down, Maddie. Yeah.
Right along here. Fortunately, I connected with two professional climbers, and I asked them if they could climb up and finish the job. Materials up there, and that's the way we went up in 1987.
British climbers Hazel Findlay and Madeline Cope have scaled walls all over the world, but this will be their first attempted summit in Sudan.
Footing here is really unstable, so if you can hold on.
Can we gear up? Cool.
When we went up in 1987 and 89, we only had slides. Before the digital age, our capabilities are so much better nowadays, so it's great to be able to do this again and have good photographs.
Were there any sort of did you see quite a lot of big cracks when you were up there?
I think there are enough. I think you'll find enough to get along, but there's a stretch up there where there's not much.
Yeah? Don't drag that rope across to the right, because there's a big boulder perched on the ledge there. Okay, I'll pull on the other one.
Hazel picks the route, while Maddie secures the ropes from below.
Hey, I'm just going slow because I don't have any pro. It's actually, like, a tiny bit scary.
There's 60 meters of fragile rock between Hazel and the inscription. Fortunately for the climbers, Kushites left them something to hang on to. Huge holes bored into solid sandstone. Once, those holes held the wooden beams of a supersized scaffolding. Workers would have built the frame from the ground up, using a crane to hoist each beam into place. Hazel becomes one of the few in modern times to reach the summit of the sacred pillar.
Okay, Maddie, I'm safe. Climb when you're ready.
Now it's Maddie's turn to start up, while Hazel belays from above.
Yeah, definitely carefully going to all of these holes.
All right, on the summit. Yeah.
Congratulations, you made it.
Now it's time for the real work. Rappelling down the cliff face, Hazel looks for the engraving that few have seen up close since the Kushites created it more than 2,600 years ago. Placed under a statue of the pharaoh Taharka, it was a bold declaration proclaiming his triumphs.
A little bit farther down. Great, now move around to the front. You see the inscription up there?
Oh, yeah.
How does it look?
Crumbling.
It looks like the left edge of the inscription has crumbled away.
Can you see the little nail holes?
Yeah, I can see some nail holes. Yeah, I see them.
Tim Kendall believes that nailed on top of the engraving were thin sheets of gold, making a bold, shining beacon to draw the eye of all who passed by.
No, I don't even have a picture of that, so that's great. That's a wonderful shot. That's new. I've never seen that before.
And then we weren't sure whether this was natural or not. It was really deep, long.
So they were really hauling up stones and cement.
Yeah.
Well, this will be really great to add to the final report. 28 years later? 28 years later.
The damaged plaque was Taharka's declaration of his own divinity and a defiant jab at the Assyrians. He calls them Bedouin. I, Taharka, the good God, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, who lives forever. I have destroyed the Bedouin of Asia, and I have cut down the desert dwellers of Libya. Despite Taharka's tough talk, by the end of his reign, he had very little of Egypt left under his control. The Assyrians dogged Taharka with invasions and ultimately rolled his borders all the way back to Thebes. But Jebel Barkal stayed under Kushite control. And there, according to Tim Kendall, Taharka chose a special place to be buried and spend eternity, full of religious and astrological significance.
If you're standing on the top of Jebel Barkal, you can see Taharka's pyramid in the distance. And on New Year's Day, which would be about July 31st, the sun would appear to rise directly over the king's tomb. 3.5 months later, if you're standing on the summit of Taharka's pyramid looking to Jebel Barkal, the sun sets right over the pinnacle, and the pinnacle looks like the god Osiris. The setting sun symbolizes the god's death. It's exactly the time when the Nile falls, when fertility ends, and the god is thought to die. So he's born on New Year's Day, he dies 3.5 months later when the Nile falls. He's resurrected every year, and he's reborn millions of times, year by year.
Tim says Taharka built his pyramid at Jebel Barkal to form a bond with the birthplace of Amun that would last for all eternity. The Kushite dynasty would not last forever. In 593 BC, Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik II led an army into Kush. Psamtik attacked the Nubians with a special ferocity. Years before, a Kushite pharaoh had executed his great-grandfather. Psamtik launched a campaign to erase the 25th dynasty from history by destroying every statue his army could find and chiseling the names of Kush pharaohs off every monument. In the ultimate insult to Kush, soldiers even chopped the sacred Egyptian cobra from Kushite crowns. The rewriting of history persists to this day.
For example, just by looking at the facade of the Cairo Museum, where all the great dynasties of Egypt are inscribed on panels, marble panels. The only dynasty that's omitted is the 25th.
Back at El Kuru, the discovery of the third room, the burial chamber, has gotten everyone excited. But Jeff's license to excavate has expired. In 2 days, he'll be heading home. The king's bones and golden treasures could be lying mere meters away. But the team will have to wait until next year to dig them up.
So this is a very exciting moment, but it's also a disappointing moment. And unfortunately, with the time and the resources that we have available to us, we simply can't excavate this safely and responsibly this year. So it's very disappointing to get this far, to have moved 100 tons of sand and dirt. But we know that it will be here for us next year, and we'll return and hope to find wonderful things.
But Jeff's not going home entirely empty-handed. He's been invited to help out at a nearby dig site and to bring along some high-tech friends. This is Zuma Village, the site of a noble burial mound built around 1,000 years after Pharaoh Taharka died. It was the twilight of the empire. A rival African nation was about to wipe out the Kushites for good, and Christianity would soon transform the region.
Hi Jeff.
Yeah, Mahmoud.
Hello Jeff.
How are you? Nice to see you.
كله تمام؟
Kullu tamam.
Alhamdulillah. I have something here for you to see. Come along.
At Zuma, Jeff's colleague Mahmoud El Tayyib has made an important new discovery.
Jeff, now we are approaching to the burial chamber.
All right.
I will show you.
The layout of this white sandstone tomb is different from Q1. Here, a tunnel leads back to a shaft with burial chambers below. Jeff puts one of his robots to work. There's no gold here. Broken burial objects indicate this tomb, like all Kushite tombs, has been hit by looters. But for the archaeologists, it's still a treasure trove of clues about this mysterious culture.
Amazing.
Isn't that incredible? Okay, so there is a long-necked jar in the back. Is that another variety of beer jar? We'll pan over to the right. There's a pot stand with a cup. And what's that inside the cup there?
It's a stone.
Just fallen perfectly into the,
Yes.
into the cup. Wow.
The brick and mortar wall looks like it could have been built yesterday, but it's as old as the tomb, protected from the elements for 1,500 years.
I'm going to just see if we can get a good view of the burial itself.
At last, Jeff lays eyes on the bones of a king, or at least a nobleman, laid to rest in this tomb. This is just the beginning. It will take years of analysis to discover his place in Sudan's history.
I really dreamed to find something extraordinary, and that was great, really, to have such finds. Burials for kings. If I could talk to him, I would ask him, who are you? And what is the importance of this place in which you are buried now?
It's a find of a quality that we dream of. So, you know, I was really glad that Mahmoud was sharing it with us. And of course, I wanted it myself. So it provided a great model for what we could hope to find here at El Kuru.
By the time the village of Zuma was created, Egypt's influence had waned, and the kings of Kush no longer built grand pyramid tombs. Their zenith as pharaohs had lasted less than a century. But in that short time, this small kingdom had toppled a giant and seized its place among the great empires of the ancient world. And now, thanks to the science underway in Sudan, the Black Pharaoh's empire of gold is stepping out of the shadows forever.